This is Duke University. I'll briefly summarize what I mean by Blackness Unmoored and link Stuart Hall's notion of the global postmodern to ideas of the post-soul aesthetic in order to make a case for the migrant urbanity as a useful framework for considering the meanings of Blackness in the present moment. So not in a kind of mythical space, not in a dream space or an imaginary space, but in the here and now. I'll conclude with a brief reading of Stromae's Formidable that will focus on the ideas of relationality as yet another site of aesthetic and ontological inquiry. I use unmooring to signal my understanding of Blackness as a subjectivity produced by displacement. I focus primarily in the larger project on contemporary literature and also music by and about first and second generation Black immigrants. They produce narratives that disrupt the conventional Euro-American immigrant trajectory, which is one that privileges ideas of progress, often expressed in terms of linearity, departure, transplantation, eventual assimilation, right? That's the goal of the immigrant narrative. But Blackness disrupts that linearity, or the anticipation of belonging or freedom in the destination is disrupted by the kind of pervasiveness and the reality of an anti-Black world. I focus on immigrant experiences in this project specifically because I think it identifies and situates a subjectivity that oscillates between optimistic and pessimistic standpoints. And I think this is a productive site of inquiry into the split subjectivity that characterizes so much of Black life at the turn of the century. A psychic doubling conveyed in Black studies by the language of unfreedom, unbelonging, non-being, slash, right, between the un and the condition of possibility that is also an impossibility, is an attempt to kind of rhetorically capture the contradictions and the dualities and the confusions of Blackness. My work, rooted in a similar investment in making visible and legible Black life, gestures towards the opening and the invitation to self-making and remaking, that the migrants breaking away from the moorings, right, of what we usually use to constitute the self, community, tradition, values, history. Once that's broken away, what becomes possible? The question that drives much of my work, and which I see in many of the texts that I write about, is whether the discourse around Blackness can fully encompass the totality of Black perspectives and experiences, whether it can imagine multicultural and socially integrated spaces in which Blackness is lived and can find full expression, right? So as opposed to the kind of imagined space or the communal space, what happens when Black bodies are in kind of the public arena? And the narrative that we know is one of the erasure of Black being. But I think what I'm trying to say, think about is how the art is trying to imagine Black being, right? A kind of Black interior in a dialectical relationship with the exterior, with the surroundings, right? Black art, the Black aesthetic, transforms what was once a monologue about otherness into a dialogue about difference. But the song is about love, loss, and loneliness, which is an affective terrain that I think is linked to or commensurate with a post-soul exploration of Blackness. It also conveys the incommensurability of an experience that is defined simultaneously, that's suspended between racial alienation and postmodern hybridity. The video's portrayal of an urban contact zone in the form of a transit stop, I think is deliberate, right? It's not in a neighborhood. It's in a space where everybody passes through, but nobody stays. And it captures the dynamism and multiplicity of a city whose population is comprised largely of immigrants. Disorderly black body in the public square, I think, invokes the idea of the kind of the refugee or the African stranger who's always outside, even when, physically in that space. Migrant consciousness or subjectivity, Sarah Ahmed argues, is produced by the loss of the familiar, of shared understandings, and of established intimacies, right? So the rupture produces a migrant consciousness, the break from what we know. This is a longish quote from Ahmed. It is in this mode of disorientation that one might begin to wonder, what does it mean to be orientated? How do we begin to know or to feel where we are, or even where we are going? By lining ourselves up with the features of the grounds we inhabit, the sky that surrounds us, or the imaginary lines that cut through maps. How do we know which way to turn to reach our destination? I'm also gesturing towards the formal aspects of the video itself, the way it was constructed and disseminated, which generates a kind of, if not confusion, disorientation. It makes the viewer's experience of the familiar, what we think we know, it makes it strange. You get this kind of that kind of shadowy presence that Smith was invoking, right? The surveillance cameras that have become so pervasive in this kind of post 9/11 era. I think I cut it off, but immediately after the police approach him, he kind of shifts. There's a kind of shift into a kind of racial consciousness, which is a Du Boisian double consciousness. The you that the song is addressing shifts from the lover to the onlookers, and he says, "What's wrong with you looking at me like an ape, you?" That enjambment is important. I read that enjambment as a kind of rejection of the assumption that abjection is a property of blackness and formidability, wholeness, autonomy, happiness is the sole property of whiteness. Instead, Formidable imagines a subject position, right? A vision of the human beyond Western bourgeois conceptions of man that recognizes the kind of beauty and insight in a subjectivity that's rooted in vulnerability, interdependence, fragmentation, and flux. I want to think about relation and orientation. Ahmed reminds us that the question of orientation is also one of relation. How we orient ourselves, who and what we feel ourselves connected to, what we imagine is possible, or what we can do in the world outside of us, is a question of relationality, which is a question of personhood. Tina Camp talks about the camera as a technology of capture, right? A kind of fixing of the other on the other side of the gaze. That is a kind of discursive and ideological violation, right? That kind of repeats the colonial narrative. The question of ethical relation offers multiple points of entry here. In addition to registering the Black interior, the filmmaker's use of hidden cameras captures the kind of complex interracial relations of this present moment. So you have the police, right? The narrative of the police is one of kind of state-sanctioned violence. But these kind of random acts of kindness, right? The woman who comes and urges him away from the curb. I think that there's a kind of meditation on, what do we do with these moments? Certainly, these acts of individual beneficence, right? They cannot mitigate the structural violence of racism, right? The institutional violence of racism. But these kinds of small moments happen every day, right? They're part of the Black everyday too. And I think that there's a kind of effort in a lot of the narratives that I study to kind of sit with that, even despite the inability to reconcile that with the sedimented, still pressing histories of domination and violence. You have a Black woman holding a cell phone as she walks close to snap a picture of Stromae, right? So she kind of at this particular moment really embodies a kind of objectifying, voyeuristic, anthropological gaze. So certainly one interpretation of this is that the identity of the observer matters less than the structural violence embedded in the act of looking at Blackness. Right? So first of all, we have this kind of invitation to think about the ways in which Black subjects in this moment, right, of increased public participation it's in danger of colluding with white power. Secondly, the absence of racial kinship in this moment suggests that we also need to grapple with the challenges of intraracial differences, right? Which is what I was talking about in terms of the immigrant subject disrupting the kind of way in which we conceptualize Blackness.
What is there to resolve? What exactly is the question that someone like Stromae or some of the other artists and writers that you talk about, what is there to actually resolve?
Like belonging is supposed to signify a kind of resolution of the rupture, right? How do you repair the break? Whether we're thinking kind of historically, right, the Middle Passage, whether we're thinking about the kind of individual moment of the individual's taking from home. Right? So where's the space of belonging? And so I think that the kind of conventional immigrant narrative would say, once you're assimilated, then the difference is resolved. You're no longer different, right? And so one problem, right, for Black subjects is that is as long as anti-Blackness is operating, right, that is an impossibility. It's unresolvable. The other side, the more critical argument would be that the more kind of critical framing of that trajectory would say that assimilation requires a kind of forgetting of the self, an erasure of history, a kind of, it is predicated on a kind of internal rupture. So it's actually not a kind of resolution. Right. So I think my point about staying in the space of transit is that he's kind of sitting with